My opponent plays the pawn to e4, and I respond with the small move d6, which is called the perk defense. The idea is to hold back the advance of the pawn from e4 to e5, so that I can then play knight to f6 and attack this pawn. Of course, he can push forward, but I could eliminate it. He could recapture with the knight, that's possible, but he prefers to play king dc3 to defend. And so here, to prevent the pawn from coming to d4, I could play c5. And for those who know, we could easily end up in a Sicilian defense. But I want to let him play the pawn to d4 to stay in the perk defense, and I play g6 with the idea of putting the bishop on g7, on the longest dark diagonal of the board, and very soon to castle. My opponent plays bishop to c4. You see, he doesn't want to push this pawn to d4. I play bishop to g7. I have to be careful about attacks on f7, but for now it's okay. He plays d3, freeing the bishop on c1, and now if I to castle quickly, he could very well steer the game toward opposite castling, meaning he could develop his bishop, his queen, queenside castling, and ultimately take advantage of the g-pawn to push his own h-pawn as a lever against the g6 pawn to open the file and try to attack my king. What I'm telling you is that if I kingside castling, I might be exposing myself to a direct attack on my king, so I'm not going to reveal my king's position right away, and I think I'll end up playing c5. He plays bishop to f4. See, that's what I was saying. I felt my opponent didn't want a kingside castling. He plays bishop to f4 and prepares queen to d2 and queenside castling. That's why I don't want to reveal my king's position right away, so we'll also prepare an attack on his king. For now, I'll play knight to c6, and as soon as he plays queen to d2, you see, he does play queen to d2 and prepares queenside castling. Here I'm thinking about a 6 to push b5 so that I too can be able to attack his castling. But just before that, I'm going to play a slightly odd move, h6. This will prevent him from exploiting the square h6 and coming into h6 to eliminate my bishop on g7. Here my bishop on g7 and my rook on h8 protect the pawn on h6, so he can't do it. And he ends up kingside castling. You might say, now I can't kingside castling, otherwise I lose the pawn on h6, since the rook won't be there anymore. That's true. So what am I going to do? For now, I'm going to play bishop to g4. You never know, if he leaves the knight there, I'll take it, which will dismantle the shelter of his king, with the pawn on g2 recapturing on f3. So either he moves his knight, or he comes to protect his knight with his queen. And he plays queen to e3, coming to protect the knight with the queen while still keeping pressure on h6. So here I could very well give up my bishop of the white square, and then I could to castle. But I can also play king and escape, king to g8, king to h7. It's slow, but it would allow me to defend h6 and free my rook. But it's still quite slow. I prefer to trade my bishop for a knight. And now kingside castling. So be careful. The pawn on f7 is pinned, so if I play a move like queen g3, it will threaten queen takes g6, and I won't be able to recapture, so I'll have to move my king to h7. And my opponent plays rook e1, so with rook e1, maybe he wants to support the push to f5. If I play knight to d4, I'll force his queen to go back to d1 to defend the pawn on c2. But for now, I prefer my knight to keep an eye on the control of the e5 square. I'm going to play a 6. A 6 is a move that could allow me to play b5. For now, I'm not really sure. Listen, I'm going to play knight to d4, will force his queen back to d1, and after the b5 push, if bishop goes to b3, I'll also have the chance to take his bishop. On b5, he can come to d5, but he can be taken out by the knight, or I can simply move my rook and then play e6 to push back his bishop. And now he plays q3, so he gives up the pawn on c2. Is he threatening anything with the queen? Yes, he gives up the pawn on c2 to counterattack on the pawn on h6. But when I take the pawn on c2, I attack his rook. So I'm going to take on c2. If bishop takes, I don't react, I take his rook here. I don't react on h6, but I take his rook on e1. And that's why he comes to d1. He could have come to c1 as well to attack my knight. And now the pawn on h6 is still under attack, so I'm going to play king h7. I defend h6, and since my knight isn't under attack, it can stay there and calmly go back to d4 later. And in the end, I captured a pawn in my opponent's camp. A pawn might not seem like much, but now it will allow me to provoke favorable exchanges, since each exchange brings me closer to an endgame where I'll have one more pawn, and therefore a better chance to promote to a new queen. So with knight to d4, now I'm putting pressure on his bishop, and what's more, capturing will dismantle his pawn structure. There will be doubled, isolated pawns here, which are very weak. And if the knight wasn't there, watch out, there's knight to e2, the fork, king bishop, but the knight defends. On the other hand, look, he just played bishop to a4 to preserve his bishop, but I'm going to be able to play b5, chase away his bishop, then b4, chase away his knight, and the fork on e2. So b5, we attack his bishop, b4, we attack his knight, and knight e2, the fork. We're going to play like that. Before, there we go, we're attacking his knight. And unfortunately, he might resign because of this fork on e2. He plays knight to d5. Does he threaten anything? Careful, he's threatening knight takes. I wouldn't be able to recapture with the bishop because of captures on h6, so I'd have to recapture with the pawn. But I can also take his knight first, but if the bishop recaptures, it will attack my rook. I'm going to play knight to e2, because when I take his bishop, he actually won't be able to attack h6 anymore. If I take his bishop, he recaptures with the knight though. So I'll eliminate his knight first, then I'll take his bishop, attacking his queen and his bishop if he recaptured with his bishop on d5. There we go. Knight takes, I attack his queen, I attack his bishop, I provoke some exchanges, and now it's not just an extra pawn, it's a whole extra piece. So if I capture the piece, he responds by taking back. Does he have an immediate threat lurking somewhere? I don't see any. Do I have any? I don't really see many threats I could make either. I'm going to play queen a5. I bring out my queen to go attack the pawn on a2. You have to open up the lines a bit so that my rooks can have some files. When I take the pawn on a2, I'll be attacking the pawn on b2 twice to create a passed pawn for black. A passed pawn is a pawn that the opponent won't be able to block with their pawns. So he plays a3. That was predictable, I take. And I recapture, and now the pawn on a6 becomes a distant passed pawn, by the way. He plays rook a1. He forgot about the bishop, so of course I take. And now I think he's about to resign. No, he doesn't resign. He plays queen e2. He's attacking the pawn on e7. My bishop moves back to defend the pawn on e7. I have to defend everything. He plays the pawn to h3. I'm going to propose a queen's exchange with queen b2. I'm protected, and I free up the whole file for my pawn to advance. And the square for promotion is a black square controlled by the bishop, so he's going to have a really hard time. He plays queen d2. He's attacking my queen here. I'm probably going to give it check. I'm going to check on c1. If he goes to h2, I can check again, but he can play g3. He puts the rook here. Well, I'll go to c3. He kept attacking my queen, so we'll calmly keep the queen safe and then push the pawn forward. He just played the pawn to g3, so we'll calmly push the pawn a forward. He won't be able to stop this promotion march of the pawn a. Come on, the little pawn has to run. With its little legs, it moves forward step by step. Queen comes to e3. I don't know why. Maybe he wants to try something, but I'm pushing the pawn forward. And after rook c1, I can even sacrifice the queen. Queen takes pawn a2, and anyway, the square is controlled by the bishop, so we can sacrifice the queen and play the pawn to a2 now, and the square is controlled. The new queen arrives. He plays the pawn to d4. We'll take. And in any case, the queen is still guaranteed. For now, he doesn't resign. He doesn't realize it's over. He plays queen here. Everything he's attacking is protected. We make a new queen. And how do we checkmate quickly? Now, I need to be able to get into position to deliver mate, so I need to be protected by another rook. So I'm going to play the queen to e1. I put a little pressure on the f2 pawn, and I free up the square for the rook, so I can then play queen to h1 mate. Now he plays h1. What is he going to do? Take. Yes, maybe I can let him look. I'll play rook there. He takes, I take back. He'll win the rook, but after that there will be mate on h1. So rook to a1 will give him a bit of hope with this capture of the rook, but queen to h1 will unfortunately put an end to the game for him. Checkmate. The rook protects the queen controls diagonally. For those who know, this is called the cosiomite. Come on, my opponent plays the pawn to f4, and I'll reply with the move c5, the Sicilian defense. My opponent plays c3. This is called the Alapin variation. Named simply after the player Mr. Alapin, he plays c3 to support the d4 push. I like to play d5 in this case because if there's a capture, sure, my queen recaptures, but it can't be chased away by the development of the knight to c3. Which is usually the case when the queen is on d5, white play nc3 very quickly. Here they play d4. And look, it's very interesting what is about to happen. I can create an isolated pawn, for example, I can take, but if they recapture, generally white will immediately recapture with the c3 pawn. Sure, they'll have an isolated pawn, but they'll regain the c3 square for their knight. So I'm not going to take the pawn on d4 right away. I'll first play knight to f6. I'll develop a bit, and I'll wait before taking this pawn on d4, before creating the isolated pawn. Of course, it's true, he can also take on c5 himself, and there won't be an isolated pawn. So my opponent plays knight f3, bishop g4 is a common move, but not necessarily the best for those who know. In analysis, this bishop move to g4 isn't always considered the best. This move is also a very good one as well, and that's what I'm going to play. This allows the bishop to defend the pawn on c5, meaning that if my opponent takes, I can exchange the queens, disrupt his king's castling, and recapture the pawn on c5 with my bishop. Queen to a4, check. The advantage of not having moved the bishop, of not having developed it to g4, is that I can respond to this attack. I can, of course, play bishop to d7. My opponent might even play bishop to b5, by the way. I also have the option of knight to c6. I'm not sure which is best. I think I'll play bishop to d7 for now, and I'm pretty sure he'll play bishop to b5. No, he plays queen to c4, offering to exchange the queens. And here, I'm actually going to keep developing, because if I'm the one who takes, I'll just help his development by letting his bishop come out to c4, so I'd rather play knight to c6. If my opponent takes, I'll recapture with the knight. Why? Because if I recapture with the pawn, after the exchange on c5, I'll be the one with an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn in chess is a pawn that can no longer be protected by another pawn. So in this position, if he takes my queen, I'll recapture with the knight. If he takes the pawn on c5, I'll recapture with the bishop. Each time, these are fair exchanges. There won't be an isolated pawn for either side. But listen, I'll be well developed with black. C'est plutôt une bonne nouvelle. Because obviously with black, we always have more development problems. So he takes on d5, you see, so I recapture with the knight. I have 3 pieces developed against only 1. Granted, my bishop d7 isn't very well developed, but it's his move. So for now, it's still pretty even. But here, I'm seriously considering taking on d4, to create this time the isolated pawn on his side. Even if he recaptures with the knight, I take back, he recaptures with the pawn and there will be this isolated pawn. But here my opponent plays bishops b5. So if I take on d4, he'll take my knight first. I'll recapture with the bishop, and only then will he recapture with the knight, and he will have avoided any isolated pawn in the position. After all, I will win the pair of bishops, meaning I will be the only one with the bishop of the white square in the position. I will have both bishops and he will have only one. In an open position, my bishops, which have long range, will certainly have more influence than his knight, so I will take on d4 anyway. And now we'll see. Will he take my knight, or will he accept the isolated pawn by immediately recapturing on d4? This is a critical moment for him. Which capture will he choose? We will finally get some clarity on the pawn structure in this game. What kind of pawn structure will we be playing? He takes on d4, so we will play the pawn structure with the isolated pawn. Look, I take on d4, I know he can take my bishop and to castle me, but there are no more queens on the board. It's not a problem to have the king out of castling position when there are no more queens. Who is going to attack my king? He doesn't have a bishop on a white square. There are no queens. He has no development in the position. All the pieces are on the first rank. There's no problem. So now I'm going to look for the attack on d4. I'm also looking at other attacks, for example kdb4, which threatens kdc2. I suppose that after knight c bishop 4, he'll have time to play knight ca3 to defend the c2 square. But there's the entry on... He'll play king e2. I could take the bishop on the black square. He'll recapture, but in the end, I'll just be helping him develop a lot. Otherwise, I have bishop b4 check, but after bishop b4 check, he'll play bishop d2. I'm really tempted to play bishop e7. It's more modest, but the idea is to put the bishop on f6 to attack the isolated pawn. And that's how I'm going to play bishop e7. I put the bishop on f6, I attack this isolated pawn. I'll probably force him to play bishop e3 to defend. No, he plays rook d1, and now I'm still going to look at this idea of knight b4. How is he going to defend the entry on c2? In my opinion, he'll play knight a3. And now my knight can go to c6 to attack twice, but I won't control the square very well anymore. He could play d5 to get rid of his isolated pawn and open the d-file to the advantage of his rook. So what I'm going to do is slide my rook from h8 to d8, probably move my king to e7, and open up the file so that my rook can help my bishop in attacking the isolated pawn as soon as my knight has moved. My knight could go to f5 or c6, for example, after knight e7, knight f5, or knight c6 to attack the isolated pawn on d4. Now my opponent plays knight to c3. That's interesting because I can also capture. Of course, he recaptures with the pawn, so the pawn on d4 would no longer be isolated, but the pawn on c3 itself becomes weak. For example, I can play rook to c8 and attack this pawn on c3, forcing my opponent to defend. Why not actually? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shift the weakness to c3 now. And look, rook to c8, I attack c3, so now he's going to bring his bishop to defend, probably bishop to d2. No, he plays bishop to b2. And now do I play rook to c4 or not? Careful, if I play rook to c4, he'll want to play d5. But that will free up my bishop to attack c3, so I'm going to play rook to c4. I lock in the weakness of the pawn on c3. You see, I'm fixing this pawn weakness, a backward pawn that can't be protected by another pawn, and that forces the bishop into a very passive role. It's actually a big pawn, that bishop on b2. An interesting game. I don't have a huge advantage. I just think I have a slight edge. He plays rook to c1, so now I can play rook to a4 and attack the pawn on a 2. He might play a 3 to defend, and then I could possibly play b5 to control the c4 square. Now I'm not obliged to attack the pawn on a 2 right away. I'm going to take my time. I'll play king c6, king d5. I'll bring up the king to fix his structure. You see, I'll play rc6, rd5, the rook on c4, the rd5 on a white square. They're untouchable. I'll fix d4 and c3, bring the other rook to c8, and at some point switch to attacking the pawn a. And if the pawn comes to a3, there will be bishop e7 to attack that pawn twice as well. We're going to try to fix all these pawns on black squares. See, here I play rd5, I fix everything. Then on rook f4, if he pushes c4 check, the rook can come back to take. But I'll even play the 7th rook to c8 to put on maximum pressure. Then I move to a4, I attack the pawn on a 2, and you see on c4 the square is very well controlled. I have a more centralized king. He has a very fragile pawn structure. He has more pawn islands than I do, meaning his pawn structure is more fragmented. Pawn islands are groups of pawn. He has a group of pawn here, a group of pawn here, and a group of pawn here. So he has 3 groups of pawn. I only have 2. And the fewer groups of pawn you have, generally the less vulnerable your pawns are. So he plays the pawn to a3, but bishop e7, and we attack the pawn on a3 twice. You see, my king can enter on c4, attack his rook, then go to b3 and attack his bishop. I still have ways to break through, because now he's probably going to play rook a. No, he plays rg1. But I take, he'll want to pin me, but the bishop goes back with check, actually. Look, bishop takes, he's going to play rook a1 to pin me, thinking that if my bishop moves, he'll take my rook. Except my bishop will move with check. No, he didn't pin me, he took. He can play c4 here. Because if rook takes, he'll take here. But he can do rook takes. I take there. He gives me check, we'll take his pawn on d4, he checks me again, we'll block here, he takes, I take back, and the 2 pawns are going to win now. He can't do anything anymore. He'll try to bring his king, but we'll oppose it. The a pawn will win easily, and he resigns. So the important moment is this one. Look, when he plays c4, so I take his pawn on c4, he takes my rook on a3, but I take his rook on c1. So in the end, I don't lose a piece, I don't lose a rook, and I even win some pawns in the process. But on rook takes, if he had taken that rook first, then I would have taken his rook on d3. And his pawn remains attacked, his rook as well, and it's the same, he loses pawns. So he had no way to save himself in this position. All right, new game. I have black, my opponent plays e4, and I'm going to play e5. Symmetry, nothing crazy for now. He plays knight c3. This is what's called the Vienna game. Usually we're more exposed to the move knight f3, so I play knight to f6, and he plays pawn to f4. So he's really playing a Vienna game. For those who know, he didn't want to play the knight to f3 right away to leave the f-pawn free. If he had played f4 immediately instead of nc3, it would have been the king's gambit. But he played nc3 first. Why? To lock down the central square d5 and prevent central counterplay. But that's why I played the knight to f6. It's so I can still play d5 and have that central reaction. If he takes my pawn on e5 while attacking my knight, I can take his pawn on e4, which is defended by my pawn on d5. And there you have it. That's exactly what happens. And he plays d4, and I'm definitely going to do the en passant here. He'll probably recapture with the bishop, in my opinion. No, he recaptures with the queen, offering a queen's exchange. Why not? And now we're going to start attacking his pawn on e5. He comes to defend with knight ef3. I could play bishop g4 to threaten his knight, but he himself could play bishop b5 to pin my knight. I don't really want to play bishop g4, bishop b5, because if he takes my knight on c6, he'll dismantle my pawn structure and I'll have a bad pawn structure for the endgame. I don't really want that. Maybe I should play a 6, but that's a bit passive. I'd end up behind in development. Or else I can develop my bishop and simply prepare kingside castling for now. Maybe that's what I'll do. I could develop the bishop to c5 to prevent him from kingside castling, but he'll just develop that bishop and queenside castling anyway, and my bishop won't be targeting anything. So for now, I'll play bishop to e7. It's a somewhat restrained move, but at least it prevents any incursions on g5 and gives me control over that square on g5. He plays bishop to e3, and if he had played bishop to b5 now, I had bishop to d7. I'm also considering knight to b4, but he can play bishop to e4. I'll calmly play bishop to d7 to prepare for queenside castling. I'll also do queenside castling if he does queenside castling. And there you go. We're both going to have a queenside castling. Honestly, I'm not very comfortable in this position. So he has this isolated pawn, but this pawn still controls quite a bit of space. It can be easily defended, bishop f4, rook e1. And I'm going to have some pawn weaknesses as well. The pawn on f7 is on a semi-open file where his rooks could position themselves to attack. The bishop can come to attack, sometimes following the arrival of the knight. I would have my own weaknesses. I'm not feeling very comfortable in this position. Let's not forget that if my knight moves, there's also the risk of losing the pawn on a7. I couldn't try to play b6 to trap his bishop, because the other bishop would come to i6 and could even checkmate me. So I'll have to waste a tempo playing king b8 to properly defend the pawn and give my knight freedom of movement again. You see, he already has his rooks connected, and so do I, but I can't really attack his pawn on e5 while he's going to start attacking my pawn on f7, I think. So in this position, I would say it's an advantage for my opponent. I would give a slight advantage to white. I don't know what I missed in the opening. Maybe we'll look at it in the analysis afterwards, because right now I'm not feeling very comfortable. He handled his opening well, his Vienna game. This will give us a chance to study this opening. Well, for now he's taking a bit of time. He's thinking. This is really the first moment where he's thinking. I'll speed up this sequence in editing now to take you straight to the move he played. So as you can see, he's now gone below my time. I hope he'll continue this game. So he's not disconnected, he's well connected, but he's thinking for a long time. So let's see what he's preparing for me. He plays bishop d5, there it is. He played that move, it's not bad. Listen, here I'm not too worried about bishop takes, and bishop takes a 7, because this time I could play b6, he would have lost his light squared bishop. I'm going to play a small move like a 6. The idea is really to prevent those pieces from coming into g5. So he plays the pawn to a 4, why not? I think I'm going to play kb8. I'm still going to secure my 3 pawns well from the attack of his pair of bishops, you see? He plays bishop d5, he's attacking the pawn on ef7. If I play bishop f6, he'll take the knight and dismantle my pawn structure. So I'm going to play a slightly more passive move, but I'll play rf8 to defend f7. Then look to play knight b4 to push back his bishop. And free up mine and attack his pawn on a 4, by the way. That's an idea I hadn't necessarily thought of, but in any case, my pawn on a 7 was attacked, so it was worth moving my king. He plays the rook to e1, knight b4, now I'm attacking his bishop, I'm attacking his pawn, he might come to b3. No, he takes on f7. Why does he take on f7? What did he see? If rook takes, he saw e6, my bishop is pinned. Well, no, the bishop protects. I don't know what he saw. He takes here. If rook takes, the fork on e6. That's clever. Very, very clever. And on top of that, I can't do anything against this fork on e6. It's so beautiful. I can't do anything about it. I'm going to play the bishop to f6. Now I don't have much time left. If he takes a rook, I'll take back with the other one. Anyway, I didn't really have a choice. He's going to get his rook back, having won a pawn. Well, not necessarily. Careful, I have to make sure there are no mates on e8. That's why he's sacrificing on h6 to checkmate me now on e8. So here he's going to win a pawn, but of course we're going to avoid that. We'll play bishop 6 to have an escape square. So now I'm down a pawn. He's playing very, very well. I'm going to have to start playing quickly. So I move to c6. He can give me a check, king to b7. That's not too dangerous. He plays the pawn here, but I'm still going to play rb7 in this position. He plays the rook here. We'll play a5. We'll try to fix all that. I also need to play a bit faster. If he pushes his pawn, I can play bishop b2, check, and pick up his knight. So he's having a bit of trouble mobilizing his majority. Maybe I'll try to bring my king a bit more into the heart of the battle. I'm down a pawn, but I'll try to have a more active king. There it is. He played the pawn to g4, so I take on f2 to capture his knight here. That way, I get back a pawn, even though I know I'm not that well off in the position. Because he has a distant majority, he comes to attack the pawn on g7, and I come to defend. And he has a bishop, which is a long-range piece that is currently dominating my knight. He's going to come in here, that wasn't planned, to attack there. And I'm going to lose the pawn. I don't see what I can do. I'll try to bring the king back, but the problem is that my knight has no square. We'll take here, we'll go attack his bishop, he might push the pawn, and we'll mobilize the knight. He comes back to attack the pawn, I play c6, he'll play bishop to c7, knight to d5. No, he can push his pawn there, knight to g6 to hold the square, he's going to make a queen, and I'm completely done for. Completely done for. He comes there. He is still not making the queen at this point, and it is honestly really surprising to see the way he is playing right now. But wait, there it is, he finally makes the queen. And we are all absolutely stunned by that incredible turnaround. We are going to wait patiently for him right here in this spot, hoping he will eventually stalemate. I should have gone there. That way, if he made queen, there would have been stalemate. I went to the wrong square. And he checkmated. So you see, the computer still gives me 93% accuracy. For a lost game, that's still a very good score. But my opponent got 98% accuracy. With 0 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 0 blunders, and an average centipawn loss of 10, which is practically the minimum you can get, so he played a perfect game. So what's really astonishing about his play is that he played the opening, the first 10 moves, very, very quickly. And here you see he has 4 minutes, 53 seconds left. And he's going to take 3 minutes to play this move, bishop e4. And after that, he's going to finish me off. He's going to finish me off with a brilliant combination. So I can go through the few moves that were played. Bishop d5, he comes to attack f7, so rook f8, then he plays the rook to e1, I play kvb4 to attack his bishop, and I absolutely did not expect bishop takes f7. Because bishop takes f7, rook takes, the fork on e6 doesn't work, because the bishop can take back if he takes my rook on d8 to protect them. So you had to think about the sacrifice of bishop for the pawn, and then the exchange sacrifice for the bishop. Then the fork on e6. And here, I actually reacted poorly, because I should have played rook takes knight, but I did not think of that. I played badly, I am a human player, I make mistakes, I played bishop f6, which was not enough, and I found myself in trouble. Because after bishop f6, of course he's going to get his piece back, but he has bishop takes h6 with mating threats. So here, by the way, he did get his piece back. Because if he had taken back the rook, it wouldn't have worked. Here, bishop takes on h6, I could have taken back. On rook e8, the rook could have come back, protected by the bishop. There, it wouldn't have worked. He found a very nice sequence with that bishop sacrifice on the pawn, then that exchange sacrifice, then the fork. Afterwards, he doesn't make a mistake, he takes the right rook. Congratulations to him, very nice combination. Listen, that wore me out. He really made me drink the noodle water there. I'm a bit tired. I'm a bit shaken by this thrashing. Well, I'm going to stop here. We've had other interesting videos and we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. You can leave me some likes to try to support and encourage me so I can recover from this terrible combination. Goodbye, everyone.